So let's turn our attention now to the funding rates for the employer. So we're going to go behind the scenes in many respects now and look at the various different procedures that the fund itself, the pension itself, is going to go through to determine what it needs to put in. So there will be a scheme actuary that will be appointed to calculate the level of contributions that the employer needs to make to meet its obligations, and this is known rather well worded as a funding rate. So the funding rate is essentially the amount that the employer needs to put into the pot. Various assumptions will be made in arriving at this funding rate as per industry guidelines, and the pension regulator, who of course regulates the occupational pension schemes, lays out guidance to all firms as to how they and what assumptions they can use. This funding rate is going to be reviewed at least every 3 years. So that it's once every 3 years as an absolute minimum will the funding rate be established, and there's different approaches and different underlying assumptions are going to be used dependent on different pension types. This funding rate, of course, is going to place an obligation on the firm to basically what they need to put in to meet the obligations to pay for those people that are drawing the benefits out and those that will draw benefits out in the future. The scheme is going to need to be valued as well. So the Pension Act 2004 requires all DB pension schemes to be valued each year. This is extended to every 3 years where actuarial reports are being obtained on funding, but a scheme must essentially meet what's known as its technical provisions, and this is the amount of assets required to cover the scheme liabilities as they fall due. A statutory funding objective must be set for all private sector schemes. In other words, a statutory funding objective is going to be determined, and that needs to be shown essentially and published in a statement of funding principles that the trustees will produce, and that will be shown to the firm. If the statutory funding objective is not met, then a recovery plan must be drawn up. Now, there's a lot of words here that generally speaking we're throwing at you in this particular slide. But I think the key thing about this is a scheme must meet its technical provisions, i.e. it must meet what it needs to meet. What it needs to meet is known as a statutory funding objective, and this will form part of a broader published statement of funding principles that the trustees produce. That statutory funding objective must then be met by the firm. If the firm doesn't meet that, then there's a duty on the trustees to take action, as we shall see. But generally speaking, if the statutory funding objective is not met in any way, i.e. there's not sufficient in the pot or paid in the pot, then a recovery plan must be drawn up. We'll walk through this process on the next slide. So we now know that DB schemes are valued by a scheme actuary. They will essentially set that funding rate. The funding rate is set as to meet the technical provisions of the pension fund. The trustees of the pension fund are going to have the fund valued. They will publish a thing called a statement of funding principles, and you need to know what the statutory funding rate is to put that in to the statement of funding principles, where it is known as the statutory funding objective. As we've already mentioned, a recovery plan may be needed if you're unable to meet the requirements that are laid down in all of the actuarial or the valuations that are portrayed, if you're unable to meet any of your technical provisions. So from that, I hope we've managed to portray the fact that defined benefit pension schemes will need to be valued. And aside of that, there are other circumstances and situations when additional valuations might be required. And we're going to look at those now. So we're going to start by looking at IAS 19, International Accounting Standards, which essentially was designed to make pension schemes more transparent. And this requires pension schemes to publish any shortfall that they have in their defined benefit pension scheme on their balance sheet. Lots of firms have failed because of their pension shortfalls. Years ago, these pension shortfalls were not transparent. They were hidden, and lots of shareholders would buy shares in companies unaware of impending doom with the pension fund sitting behind it. That can't happen now because under IAS 19 there must be any shortfall in pension schemes published and shown on the balance sheet of the firm, which of course is in the public domain because you can obtain those from Companies House. There are also valuations that need to be done at the time that a pension fund is privy to potentially going into the Pension Protection Fund, the PPF. Now, we're going to talk about the Pension Protection Fund in other parts of the learning, but largely, if a firm running a final salary DB pension scheme suffers an insolvency event, i.e. the firm has got no prospect of recovery and ceases trading, and it's got a DB pension scheme, then essentially a Section 143 valuation is going to need to be done when the scheme enters the PPF, the Pension Protection Fund, which is there as a safety net for the employees of a firm that's now insolvent. A simpler Section 179 valuation is also undertaken to determine the levy that will be paid to the Pension Protection Fund by active firms. So all firms need to pay in a certain amount to the Pension Protection Fund by way of an annual subscription, and that will be determined each year with that 179 valuation. So we have mentioned there scheme deficits, and scheme deficits in the current working environment are sadly all too common, and any identified deficit demands the need for a recovery plan, as we've already said. So a recovery plan will be produced by the trustees, and this needs to be submitted to the pension regulator. So the regulator will see exactly what the intended recovery plan is for all defined benefit pension schemes. Now, if the deficit becomes a serious problem that's unlikely to be resolved with a business as usual effect, there are a lot of options that are available which might help a firm basically reduce that deficit. So a recovery plan may include a recommendation to increase member contributions, change the accrual rate, probably from a 60th to an 80th scheme, changing the pensional pay definitions, maybe from a defined benefit to a career average scheme, so switching to career average, or maybe extending the scheme retirement age so members need to pay in for longer and draw out for shorter periods of time. Employers must consult employees on any significant changes, and certainly any changes to what I've just mentioned would be a significant change. And consultation now is not a binding on any decision made. In other words, whilst the firm must consult, it doesn't have to listen essentially to the and follow, should I say, the actual recommendations that members make. In other words, if members want to keep it the same, then I'm afraid to say the employer can override that and instigate the changes.